Welcome to the Scottish Conservative Friends of BAME podcast. I'm Rami, a member of the board, and today I'll be hosting Iain Stewart MP for a podcast episode entitled A Constitutional Conversation, Devolution, EVEL and Federalism. So, Iain, how are you today?
Not too bad, thanks. Looking forward to the campaign ahead.
Excellent. And you're in the same position as Michael Gove, aren't you? So you're from Scotland, and then life took you down south, and you represent an English constituency. So I was just wondering, so do you think the Conservatives down south place enough emphasis on the union? What are your thoughts on this sort of issue?
I think as a party, we certainly do. And, you know, we are the Conservative and Unionist Party. And there's a very strong view amongst my colleagues in Parliament that the union is worth a lot to everyone. We all gain from being part of the United Kingdom. The phrase I often like is the UK is greater than the sum of its parts. Whether that's economically or clout on the international stage, but also from a cultural and family perspective. We are different. Scots, English, Northern Irish, Welsh are all different. Within England, within Scotland, there are different cultures and traditions. But I think they all blend together very well. And yes, I'll cheer for Scotland in the rugby pitch. Mixed results this year so far. But, you know, it's, you know, I'm being Scottish and British are not mutually exclusive things, and I define myself as British and Scottish. So I think there is that feeling amongst colleagues. I think where there is more being done now, and perhaps there wasn't enough in the past, from a government perspective rather than a party perspective, there was if you like, a devolve and forget mentality. That if an issue was felt to be devolved, then the UK government had no role in that. And I think that that was a mistake. And, you know, completely respecting the devolution settlement, there are still ways in which, you know, the UK government and the Scottish government can work effectively together. And to give an example of that, you know, in the transport sphere, yes, transport in Scotland is principally devolved, as it is in Wales, and increasingly in England, transport is, you know, whether it's the Mayor of London or Greater Birmingham, Greater Manchester. But there's a need to look at transport connectivity as a whole, and that's what we're doing through the Union Connectivity Review. So if you have a scheme like High Speed 2, how does Scotland get the maximum value from that? How do we shorten journey times to Glasgow and Edinburgh and beyond to make it an attractive alternative to flying? If you look at the A75 in Dumfries and Galloway, yes, that road is primarily in Scotland, but it's also a strategic freight route through England, Scotland, and to Northern Ireland. So it's that sort of mentality that we need to do more of and are doing more of. That strengthens the bonds that hold the union together.
And you sort of touched upon there, you know, the role of the UK government, the role of the Scottish Parliament. So, you know, when we're talking about the role of the Scottish Parliament, I guess there's sort of two ends. On the one end, you've got sort of radical federalism, where, you know, almost all the powers would be devolved to the Scottish Parliament. On the other hand, maybe you have a centralised UK where most powers are centralised in Westminster. So where on this sort of spectrum do you think the Scottish Parliament should reside?
Well, it's a fascinating question because, you know, the devolution settlement is not static. In the 22 years now since it was set up, its powers have changed quite markedly. You know, in its first iteration, it had very minimal fiscal powers. It had the ability to vary the basic rate of income tax by 3 pence up or down, which in the grand scheme of things is not a substantial power. Now, principally as a result of the 2016 Scotland Act, it raises pretty much half its revenue through control of the income tax bands and rates, the equivalent of stamp duty, and a range of other ones. It has more welfare powers. So, you know, it's the devolution settlement is not static. It has evolved, and quite probably will continue to evolve in the future. None of the sort of policies I've described are taking powers away from Holyrood. It's complementary. So if we've got a UK-wide fund, a levelling up fund, it's what we're trying to encourage there is local communities, whether it's an individual city or a rural area, putting together a bid with the local authorities, with universities, with private sector partners to say, well, what can complement the investment that is happening elsewhere? So that's, I think, a direction of travel. Federalism's it's an interesting question. It's, you know, in one way, it would be an answer to turn the UK into a federal system, as you have in Germany or Australia or Canada or many other countries, where you have the UK government looking at the big economic, foreign affairs, defence, all these sort of big issues, whereas the federal units, nations, country, whatever you describe them, deal with the domestic, you know, law and order, you know, health, education, all these things. As a concept, that was fine. So you would have England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland with its own domestic parliaments and governments, and then the UK one. The problem with that is, how do you get round the problem that England is 85% approximately of population and GDP? There isn't a successful federal model, I don't believe, that has one overwhelmingly dominant unit. In all the other countries with a federal, there are at least two, or more often more, big units that counterbalance. So what would it mean if there was an English government that had economic powers? How would that be different from the UK government? So I think a federal model on that basis is problematic. You could then say, well, why not divide England up into regions? Difficulty with that is England doesn't divide neatly into regions. Yes, you've got some parts like, you know, Greater London, Yorkshire, which would be the right sort of size for a federal unit, but the rest of England doesn't divide neatly. And my area in Milton Keynes is a case in point. Technically, we're part of the southeast region of England, along with the Isle of Wight and Kent, of which we've got virtually no ties. We're right on a three-way border with the East Midlands and the east of England. So how do you start carving up that area? There isn't an easy model. So I think the way it will evolve, you know, we do have devolution within England to, as I say, the elected mayors in the big city regions. So I don't think you'll have a formal federation. I think there will be an evolution of devolution within England, if I can put it that way, and we'll have a wonderfully British, you know, asymmetrical system, but probably not a formal federation as you find in Germany or Canada or places like that.
So you managed to come up off the cuff with a better title than I had, The Evolution of Devolution.
I can't claim an original originality for that. I remember you know, being taught about that at university, so I can't claim originality for the phrase, but it's a nice one.
Yeah, and so you've touched on the fact that, you know, over time the Scottish Parliament has been given more powers over the various you know, acts that have been passed. So you have on the one hand, you know, the capacity to do more, but how would you assess the way the Scottish Parliament has actually used the powers it has and increasingly has?
Well, that's another good question. And the first point I would make is that the additional powers that were devolved back in 2016 have not all been used. And, you know, particularly in the welfare sphere, it's, you know, yes, the Scottish government has introduced new benefit payments and supports and various things, but there's a lot still in the pipeline 5 years on. Now, part of that's a political decision not to use the powers. Another one I think they haven't used yet is air passenger duty. But it also, you know, I think it's a very telling point that, you know, devolving welfare powers, it's a vastly complex system. And quite rightly, people are proceeding cautiously, because the last thing you want to do is interrupt the support payments, you know, to some of the more vulnerable people in society. So you've got to tread with great care. But the lesson from that is, if, heaven forfend, and I hope we never get there, to the point of Scotland voting for independence, separation, how complex that is going to be to pick apart a 3 centuries old union with all the economic, financial, governmental, all the ties you can imagine. People think Brexit was complex. That will be a walk in the park compared to this. So, you know, I know some nationalists have said, oh, we'd be independent within a couple of years. I very much doubt it. So, you know, so the Scottish Government and Parliament hasn't used all the powers it has. But, you know, we take a pragmatic view as to where the right level of, you know, balance for powers lies. You know, when we left, I mentioned Brexit, when we left the EU, a vast number of powers came down from the EU level and are now residing in Edinburgh, Cardiff, and Belfast, on fisheries, on food regulation, and a whole range of things. Some of them, we said it's better for those to come down from Europe to the UK level, you know, so that we still maintain this was the UK Internal Market Bill, we maintain a UK-wide single market. Because when the devolution framework was put in the late 90s, no one envisaged as not being part of the EU single market. So the legislation was silent on that. So that's why we thought, you know, it's better for business, for ease of commerce, have that uniform across the UK, where other powers, as they went straight down to the devolved assemblies. Yeah, so administrations, not assemblies.
Yeah, and you touched on, again, the fact that, you know, there may be difficulty in actually, in an independent Scotland, actually utilising the welfare powers, because it takes a long time to develop. You know, you don't want to mess with the system, because, you know, some of the most vulnerable people in society may suffer if you get the decisions wrong. And that sort of shows that maybe the UK government has greater capacity to, you know, work on legislation and to change, you know, different things within the political system. So that then brings on the point, obviously in the UK Parliament, you've got the House of Commons and in the House of Lords, so a bicameral system. And in the Scottish Parliament, obviously, you've only got one chamber, a unicameral system. So do you think the Scottish Parliament should have a bicameral system, or do you think that the way things stand, you know, tends to work?
I think I've always been in favour of a bicameral system in any country. I know you can have a debate of, you know, how a second chamber is composed. You know, you've got a range from, you know, in America, you've got an entirely elected one. In Canada, it's a wholly appointed second chamber. In Germany, it's the Bundesrat is a forum for the Länder government to come. So there's all sorts of ways, but I think the basic principle that you have a second chamber as a safety valve, as a chance for a different group of people to look, you know, critically at proposed legislation, I think on the whole is a good thing. And as I say that, you know, sometimes, you know, as a member of the government, it's incredibly frustrating that the House of Commons has voted for something and the Lords said, hang on, think again about this part of it. You know, as I say, that can be frustrating, but on the whole, I think it's a good thing, because it does make you think, hang on, have we got this detail right? And I think it adds extra checks and balances into the system. So you know, it's not for me to decide, but I think it probably would be useful for Holyrood to have a second chamber, or at least a stronger committee system that's a bit more independent than it currently is. And I think the current drama, if I can put it that way, in Hollywood, shows that. So I don't have a fixed view in mind what it would be, but I think Hollywood would be strengthened by having that extra scrutiny of legislation.
And we spoke before about federalism and how you would divide England into different sort of regions or different wider constituencies. And that again brings the point, English votes for English laws, which is shortened down as EVEL. So for those who maybe don't know, could you explain what it is, what problem it's trying to solve, and whether you think it's been successful in actually bringing maybe more local sort of governance within England, but without having this sort of hodgepodge of different parliaments?
Yeah. Well, English votes for English laws is an attempt to answer the famous West Lothian question, which Tam Dalyell, the Labour MP, posed way back in the 1970s, so-called West Lothian because that was the name of his constituency at the time. And that question was, with devolution, MPs in the House of Commons cannot now vote on a whole range of policies, domestic policies on health, education, law and order, and so on in Scotland. But Scottish MPs at Westminster could vote on those same measures in England. So you then created some MPs who, have disproportionate powers. And, in a tight election, those MPs from Scotland couldn't tip the balance of opinion in England. So English votes for English laws is an attempt to redress that. It's not a perfect solution, because the only perfect solution is that you either don't have devolution, you have pure federalism, which we've discussed, or Scotland is no longer part of the United Kingdom. So, certainly that last option is one that I never want to see, and the devolution's here to stay. We've discussed the practical difficulties of a fully federal system. So what happens with the current iteration of English votes for English laws? The main part of a bill passing, and that's second reading and third reading, is voted on by MPs of from all parts of the United Kingdom. So no MP has got no say on all MPs have an ability to influence legislation, because arguably there could be a measure, although it's domestic in England, that would have financial consequences in Scotland and so on. However, at the committee and report stage, there is a mechanism. I won't go into the full details of how it operates because we could spend an entire podcast on that. But basically, English MPs have to consent to the bill at its committee and report stage. So if you had a situation, hypothetically, that there was a Labour government across the whole UK, but the Conservatives had a majority in England, the MPs representing England would have to consent to that measure being introduced for England. So it doesn't stop any MP, having, I say, an input into the passing of that bill. But English MPs have an additional power to stop it if they don't think it's in England's interest. Now, in practice, it's not really needed to be, it's not been significant, because all the time that English votes for English laws has been in place, the electoral outcome for the whole UK has been the same as the electoral outcome for England. So it's not been a problem. But hypothetically, it could be. In the event of a very close election overall across the UK, England might vote differently, and it's an imperfect system. No one pretends it is perfect, but it's a way to try and address that West Lothian question that was posed all those years ago by Tam Dalyell.
Excellent. Well, this has been a really insightful podcast episode. I think we've covered quite a significant swathe of topics. within maybe constitutional affairs. You know, we touched on English votes for English laws, federalism, the role of the Scottish Parliament, and many different areas in between. So thank you very much, Iain, for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Excellent, and best of luck with your parliamentary work as well.
And best of luck to all the candidates standing for Holyrood in a few weeks' time.